Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. This is a special feature of the Media Project from SM Graves Associates. And we're talking today on the Scots on the Rocks Politica podcast with my very special guest. We're talking to Travis Benson, who is a field director for ActOnMass. ActOnMass is an organization here focused on transparency in the Massachusetts state legislature. Travis, it is a pleasure to have you on this special feature.
Glad to be here, Scott. I'm excited.
I'm
I'm
glad
flattered.
that we connected, and you and I had a little bit of a opportunity this weekend to talk for the first time in greater detail about the work that you're doing, and it certainly got me personally enamored with the political landscape here in the Commonwealth. I'd like you to first, for our listeners, define the organization and a little bit what you do, and then we'll dig in from there.
Awesome. So yeah, in a very general sense, Massachusetts, the state, is very unique in not being totally transparent with its information, how state reps vote, and the information you can access within the workings of the state house. And so the organization Act on Mass, it is advocating for a rules change in late January to change some of the rules and how the legislature works so that we can see how our state reps are voting and we can see information within, uh, events that happen within the state house. So we're working throughout the state of Massachusetts in most districts to bring constituents together with their state reps because it's a very popular issue to have the constituents' voices heard to the state reps because the entire idea of this whole thing is to bring representation more towards the population of Massachusetts. And what better way of doing that than like bringing the voters to the state reps to hear how they feel about this issue?
It would seem to me, first off, let's give the opportunity for why. For those of us that are relatively or extremely engaged in the political process in the Commonwealth, that might seem like a redundant or absurd question, but let's get into why this, perhaps even more so than any other political issue that we're currently facing, is important to accomplish.
Yeah, that's a good question. So as opposed to like a lot of issues, a lot of organizations advocate within, the legislature, we're advocating for something that's a little more procedural and goes after like the inner workings of how things work. So like the legislators themselves, they every legislative session, which happens every 2 years, they will write the rules of how that session works, how like bills are passed from committee to committee, how the information is dispersed. We are trying to make it so that there are amendments filed that change the rules, which affects how other issues and other bills are passed. A lot of the time, there's just not a lot of time for us or the legislators themselves to read what they're voting on. There's a lot of bills that are rushed sometimes, especially if like you're trying to end the term limits of a speaker, which just happens to pass in one day. Whereas a lot of more important popular legislation, which we can get into later, like Safe Communities Act, which has bipartisan support, passed the state Senate unanimously, just gets stuck in the House for years and years. So what we're advocating for is rules changes that would help issues like that, help issues like progressive revenue, environmental issues, voter issues, any bill you want to get filed within the state house. These rules changes would help pass more effectively, efficiently, and represent like the general consensus of the population.
It seems to me that with a less transparent legislative process, a couple of things can happen. Number one, we live in a world, both at the state level and the federal level, where increasingly over the last especially the last 40 or 50 years, there's a lot more of the concept of the omnibus bills, which are bills that have any number of different, in a different world might be different pieces of legislation. They are some related to each other, some not. And then within each pieces of legislation in that omnibus bill, there are little tenets of law that get placed in there. On occasion, the average voting citizen might hear, quip in the news and say, "How did that get included? How did a provision specific to an environmental issue in my county or my municipality end up in a state piece of legislation related to transportation or related to finance?" Right? And you say, well, so there's this indication of perhaps with more transparency, we would understand why, how these things all interrelate, or if they even interrelate at all, and they're really just being hidden, especially more controversial provisions might be hidden in pieces of legislation. Conversely, because we also have limitations in how we interact, how the legislative process interacts with media, people will decide to support or not support really groundbreaking issues. The TCI, the gas tax, and more broadly, the TCI legislation related to climate change is an example where we really haven't, for the average voter, I don't feel, picked it apart so that people really understand all of its provisions and understand that we could potentially debate any number of those provisions before they become a law, so that the law becomes more nuanced and fair and effective for all the regions of the state. So I'm wondering if you could speak to those two things.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point you brought up. Is like there is not a lot of room for the picking apart or the debating of things. You mentioned amendments. Generally speaking, you just can't see how they're voted on. There's no time to read them most of the time before like putting them on a bill. Um, and I can talk about the specific rules changes that would help that like a little after this, but like so, for instance, on the grand bargain bill, which was voted on 2 years ago, I believe, it was to raise minimum wage to $15 an hour.
Mhm.
It just had no action for like months, and then there were changes to it, um, and it was introduced to a vote. And one of the changes was that it removed time and a half for workers on holidays and I believe weekends. And then it was voted on and it passed. And so in a day. So there was no time for anyone to react, be like, hey, that hurts me, that hurts my coworkers. Why was that introduced? Like who introduced that? And we still can't to this day go in and check and see how like who voted for that bill to begin with. um, so there's not a lot of you and me are more involved with the process than probably a lot of other people. It's very dry and nerdy. um,
But we're
but,
still in the dark. You just
but
indicated those
we
two steps where there's the procedural process, but then there's also, well, how do we do the follow-up when you can't really find quite all the information you would need to do the follow-up?
Exactly. Even for people who are like very into it, want to figure out how things work, it's still obscure. And like we actually talked to a state rep the other day because we held like 50 meetings this past month. And in one of our meetings, the state rep mentioned that they couldn't like see how a bill they cared about was like voted on in a committee, and it's like they couldn't see, and it's like, I mean, we can't see, but what does that say about like when state reps themselves can't see like how they're voted on?
That speaks to something. I have friends and peers over the years, they're now elected officials at the municipal level, at the state level, in various districts, and all of them at various points in the past have spoken to exactly that. So these are people who are on the inside, you would think, and the complaint is generally, I support transparency, and in fact, I've been burned by it a few times because we're forced to really make a decision after we haven't had adequate opportunity time frame wise to assess. And it always seems to be by surprise. You know, you and your advisors have, I think people don't realize when you're in Congress in Washington, you have a certain type of level of budget for which to have advisors and so forth, and your clerks, and they are able to do a lot of that digging. Although I don't think it's done well, and I don't think policymakers are reading well enough in a lot of cases. But technically speaking, now, if you become a state rep at most state houses in the United States, you simply don't have that level of budget for staffing. And at the municipal level, you just simply don't have it. In fact, in most cases, you don't have any staff, and yet it's not a paid position. And if it is a paid position, it's usually a stipend. So we're not giving policymakers enough time to actually read through things, and then other leaders take advantage of that, I think.
Yeah, there's a lot to that. There's a lot of influences that state representatives face that affect how they feel about how they vote. Um, I'll add on to what you just said. The police reform bill that was voted on a couple of weeks ago, like whether you have enough staff or aides or not, like that was voted on in less than 24 hours, and it was over like 120 pages. Like advocacy, like there were advocacy groups and like state reps and their aides staying up all night for that thing. It is more than like time allowed to vote for these as well. I guess I so I can get into like a little bit of the weeds of like what we're advocating for specifically in January that like we think would help uh, the process itself, help these bills come to fruition.
Please do. That's why we're here. Yes.
Yeah. So there's three amendments, and one of them is to make committee votes public. So I'll really quickly just explain like how a bill goes through the state legislature. Um, a, a law is introduced by a legislator. It then goes to a committee. When a bill is in that committee, it's either voted to, progress, or it's voted against, or it's sent to a study. Fun fact, not a lot, like barely any laws are ever voted adversely in committees. When a bill is sent to study, it is essentially a euphemism for killing a bill. Most bills are sent to study, which means they're probably not going to pass. They're probably going to be delayed for years. It's pretty much a bill graveyard.
A proverbial base in Alaska we're going to send you to.
Exactly.
So people don't hear from you. Okay.
That's not what I'm going to picture every time I think about it. So if a law is lucky enough to make it out of committee, it'll go to the Senate and the House for a floor vote. And again, there's a couple things that make it difficult to see what happens to a bill in that area. And then when it makes it out of the Senate and the House, it goes to the governor for him to sign it. So we're focusing on like the committee's part, as well as the state House floor vote part, because we think that's like where a lot of transparency lacks. Generally speaking, the state Senate does a lot of these things better. Most legislation gets delayed indefinitely, watered down, or not voted on most of the time from the state House. So that's why we're advocating for state House rules changes in late January. And those rules changes, they are to allow committee votes and testimony to be public, which is already a thing that exists in 27 other states. It exists in the state Senate, and it just allows you to see how these bills are voted on, who votes for or against these bills within committees. So if the Safe Communities Act makes it, doesn't make it out of committee or makes it out of committee, you can see who voted specifically for that to happen, which is a huge reason a lot of bills just don't make it out of committee. So that's a really big one. That's a really popular one. There was a ballot question referendum I can get into a little later about like how big this popular support is for that. Second Amendment is for just allowing more time for a bill before it's voted on. There's a lot of bills that just end up being rushed within 24 hours. Can't see what happened. You know, police reform bill, grand bargain bill, uh, the law to eliminate speaker limits. They were all rushed, and those are big things to vote for that were rushed. So we are advocating for at least 72 hours for a bill before it's voted on, so that the public, the press, and the legislatures themselves can like have time to read and react to these things. Third amendment and the last amendment is to make it easier to see votes in the state house when they come to a floor vote. So when a bill is voted on in the state house, there's the opportunity to do a roll call, which is, okay, state reps will stand in order to say, I want this vote to be public. Massachusetts has the 9th highest roll call threshold in the entire country, where we require 16 state reps to stand up in a matter of seconds to say, I want this bill, I want this vote to be public. That is, you know, you compare that to Pennsylvania, which requires 2 state reps to stand. Texas requires 1. It's a very, again, another uniquely Massachusetts thing. So most bills that are voted on in the state house are not recorded as well. And that's
over and over, and not to interrupt you, but it's interesting in the various small myriad ways our legislative procedures are not speaking to our modern sense of the forward and progressive ideals of a modern definition of a Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
That's that's so spot on. You can actually see that disconnect a lot during elections. Most, like a huge amount of challengers run, and this is like very defining for challengers compared to incumbents, people who've been in there for a long time. A lot of challengers and newcomers run like hard on the issue of transparency, because they're, again, even if you're running against, like whether you're running against a progressive Democrat, more conservative Democrat, whoever, if they've been in there for a while, if they have a higher leadership position, if they have a higher paid position, generally speaking, there's a pattern of them being less and less for transparency, because advocating for transparency really challenges the status quo. Yeah. So a lot of challengers and newcomers, they'll be like, listen, you know, the current seated rep might be for 100% renewables. They might say they are for, you know, this, they might be for that, but we can't pass this legislation if we can't see what's going on. I want to change like how we're able to see what is going on. So like it's become more and more popular of an issue. 2 years ago, 2 of these amendments were already voted on. So there's already support in that. It was already, they need like an 81 votes in order to pass. They got about around 55 from the state reps themselves. So there's already support behind it. We're just like ActOnMass is just adding to that support. Why we're reaching out to state reps throughout the country.
And what's the third amendment?
Third amendment is to reduce the threshold. Oh yeah, it's to reduce the threshold for a roll call vote. So like,
okay, so that is in fact the third amendment. Yeah,
so we require 16 state reps to stand right now. We want to lower it to 8, which is what the state Senate already does. We require 10% of our state reps to stand for a roll call. Most other states require 5%, which is like around, depending on the state, but you need like 3, 4, 5 people to stand.
Right. Yeah, it reminds me of the scene in the Broadway musical 1776 when they are depending upon the delegate from Rhode Island, Stephen Hopkins, who walks into the room after going to the privy, and he says, and I'm paraphrasing, you know, there is nothing on God's green earth that can't be debated and then voted on, right? They want it. So there's people that want to prevent the debate, so because they don't want to move to get to a vote. And, and he walks in and says, there's nothing so sacred that we can't pick it apart and then vote on it, right? It's like, why create thresholds that force votes in a certain way or the lack thereof? It's
Yeah.
just all of these small de-
They almost voted they almost voted to make it 40 people standing during COVID this summer. Isn't that
really,
crazy? Yeah,
really,
they were gonna vote on that.
I didn't know that. So 40 members of the House would be so eight. You said eight. That would be 10% of the Senate, correct? So what would 40 be as a percentage of House members?
That would be 1/4. There's 160 of them, so 40 of
25%.
them would be 1/4 of them.
Oh my God. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, that would break a lot more records for Massachusetts.
Do you think that the level or lack thereof in engagement of the average citizen is in part there's not one reason for this in my opinion, but that one key part is that people feel like even if they were a part of the process, that the process has not been designed for them, and that there seem to be all of these inherent challenges to being engaged. And after a while, people just, between that and the behavior of certain members of the House, Senate, whatever branch of government, and in this regard, I think Massachusetts is better than many other states, and certainly better than the federal government at this time. There's less
Mhm.
drama, and there's less political theatrics, um, depending on where you live, I suppose. But there you put the two together, and people just say, I can't be a part of this, and I won't be a part of it. And if they do then vote, they really don't know what they're voting for most times.
Yeah, yeah, it's tricky in Massachusetts because, like you said, there isn't a whole bunch of theatrics unless you count like the 3 last speakers, leaving because they were convicted of like, fraud and
Yeah.
corruption,
That's
but
right
like
up there, by the way, I think. That's right up there.
yeah, yeah. This what DeLeo making it out as a speaker without like getting convicted of anything was a good thing for Massachusetts. So that says a lot itself. But yeah, so what you just said, there's a huge disconnect between like what the people of Massachusetts want and what is actually voted on, and that is disheartening and that disenfranchises a lot of people. It doesn't seem bad from the outset, but once you start to like see how things work, like we have a democratic supermajority in the state house. On the party platform, they say we should have election day voter registration. It's been it's been filed for 15 years and it has still not passed, and it's on their party platform.
That
So
brings
they're not
me
so they're not even doing the bare minimum of like what's on their platform. Sorry, what were you saying?
that brings me to a question I had for you that I was thinking about this weekend, which is, it seems to me in my memory, I'm 44, and in the time that I've been a voting citizen of the Commonwealth, there are at least four distinct moments I seem to remember where items like that were put to a referendum vote. We voted for them in a November election along with our elected officials, and that those referendums have never been enacted. And it seems to me that there are several times in our past that that's happened. Am I crazy, or did I misinterpret, or was I misinformed about exactly how those referendums would work? Because one would think in any state that when you vote for or against a particular referendum vote and it passes according to the number of votes it received, that it would then be immediately enacted during the next term of the legislature. The people have
Yeah,
spoken, so to speak.
yeah, I was actually yeah, that's a very good segue. I was going to bring that up as well. Are you talking about a specific referendum?
Well, I am, and of course, I didn't write down the
Uh-huh.
the nomenclature so that I could say it's Act XYZ or whatnot. But
But it's common. It's not uncommon.
the I believe at least once in the 25 years I've been voting, that there was a referendum on it was either term limits or in some other way to limit either members of the House or Senate, and how many contiguous terms they could have. And I could be wrong about that. There were also this tax legislation more recently that
Mhm.
we voted on in referendum,
Yep.
and to my knowledge, we never enacted that act either.
Yeah, so this is a little bit, this is just like a quick tangent, but I do know that a couple years ago, there was a referendum for public financing for those who run for office, because
Yeah.
Massachusetts is one of the other things it's very not good at compared to other states, is challenging incumbents in the state, because of the lack of information of like knowing how your state reps vote. It's hard to be like, well, they vote for this, I'm going to vote for this, so I'm challenging them. Two, there's just we're one of 10 states where it's like a full-time job, and you get compensated good for it. There's a lot of time commitment, and so there's a lot of interest in, preserving those positions. Um, so that, anyways, that referendum that was for public financing for those running for office, it passed. The voters voted for it, and then they just decided to not do it, which was like, okay, they just voted against it like right after that.
And
So
I think that the vast majority of people, because we are where we are with the amount of disengagement, um, I think that folks just assume that it was passed, that the will of the people would have been enacted, and
yeah,
they didn't do any follow up. You know,
yeah. So they're definitely, and I do want to make, I guess, a distinction for anyone listening who's not into this kind of stuff. But so for referendums, it's basically like, hey, we want to put this on the ballot since like our legislator is not doing it. I'm putting it a little crassly, but it's more like, so like, okay, the people should vote for this. Let's see what the people want.
right?
Um, there are different types of it. There's non-binding referendums, which is, it's kind of like, here, let's sample like what the people want. It's
It's a
kind of like,
survey.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, it's kind of like a survey, yeah, but it's a symbolic survey. It
yeah,
shows, our leaders like what their constituents want. And then there is binding referendums, which is, if the people vote for it, it is enacted. So there was a transparency ballot initiative, a referendum this November. Um, it was in 16 different districts, and it was non-binding, but it asked the people, do you want to make committee votes public? Do you want the information on websites? And in all 16 districts, during overwhelming voter turnout, within conservative districts and more progressive districts, 90% of the people voted yes in favor of making committee votes public. So that's like, it's like a very popular bipartisan issue, um, that we want to see be represented within the House itself as well. If that many people are for it, we would think that, our representation should also represent that as well. So like what we're doing has huge amount of popular support. We're just showing our leaders this is how popular it is, because a lot of, I don't want to get too much into it, but when you do enter the House, or enter any chamber for that matter, there becomes a lot of different pressures that you don't normally have with your colleagues and leadership and your bosses. And a lot of the times, that influences how our leaders vote more so than like how the public influences them, which, is ideally what we want them to be representing. So we're bringing the pressure of the public to them to be like, I know you face like a lot of pressure within your job, but like, you know, we are the voices. We are what helps get you elected, and we do want to see these things. We want to support you and help you do a better job. But these are the things that are important to us.
right.
And one last thing, in as far as like referendums go, well, I guess not as referendums, but for like popular support. So another big thing for Massachusetts is we've been cutting taxes for the past 40 years. We have a very flat tax rate, but we do not tax the wealthy. And we've been cutting back on that for decades and decades, more so than any other state except Alabama and Alaska. Or so it's Alaska and another A state. I confuse the A states a lot. But anyways,
But we're not in good
so
company on that. On that front.
yeah, it could be better. So it's actually Alaska and Arizona.
Okay.
Um, and just recently, thanks to like actually some good organizing within the state house and some really good state reps, there was a roll call vote on a capital gains tax,
Mm.
in which is very popular amongst constituents, bipartisan again. Basically just like please tax the wealthy. Um, and so that vote was recorded, and most state reps voted against it, and it was very disheartening to see that. And that was another huge disjunct between like it's like over 70% of people want capital gains to be increased in Massachusetts, and like you see, we luckily got this vote recorded, which doesn't happen most of the time on this issue where most state reps voted against it. And it's like, why is there that disconnect? And this is the disconnect we don't get to see all the time because we can't see how votes go most
That's
of the time.
correct. Yep. Yep.
So that's what we're addressing.
A little bit on how you got into this. You worked for the Sanders campaign. Was that the 2016 campaign or the most recent campaign, or both?
Most recent.
Most recent.
Mhm.
And a little bit on the organization. How long has ActOnMass been at this? And get a little bit into the mechanics. So just so our listeners understand exactly how it all works, and then finally, how they could get engaged.
Yes, yes. So ActOnMass has been at this. So this is one of their campaigns. They did another campaign a while ago called the Voters Deserve to Know Pledge, which reached out to reps individually to ask for them to pledge to make their own votes public, and for them to stand for roll call on bills that they co-sponsor. So ActOnMass has been the leading organization on transparency in Massachusetts for a couple years now. Um, so as of right now, the past month and a half since we've started this campaign, we've had over 2,000 volunteers sign on to meet with their state reps throughout the entire state. Um, we've had 50 meetings so far. We have another 35 scheduled. I believe 23 state reps are now committed, with only 3 giving us hard no's. We're still putting pressure on escalating in the districts where we've met so far. And additionally, there's 30 Republican state reps who will most likely vote for these as well. So we're pretty much around like 53 signed on to commit so far out of like the 81 majority we need. Um, and we're only building momentum through that, so it's very exciting. We do you want me to plug now or later, or like how much do you want me to get into?
Plug away, brother.
Cool, cool. I'll plug. Yeah, I'll plug it anytime. But yeah. So anyone who's like interested, it's a very unique experience, honestly. Anyone who's like interested in meeting their state rep, like sitting down with them in a group and talking to them about the issue of transparency, wanting to see public votes and how important it is to you. Um, Feel free to check out like ActOnMass's website. That's actonmass.org
Mhm.
slash campaign. And so check that out there, because there is a sign up where you can sign on to your district team to meet with your state rep, as well as there's a cool little visual map to see like how many state reps have signed on to the commitment so far, and you can
Right.
check out if your rep has signed on or not, and decide to get involved, to call or email your rep as well.
Great. And for our listeners, this will be on our episode page for this special feature. And you'll be able to connect to ActOnMass from there in a variety of ways, just in case you missed it while you were listening. And we do highly encourage, frankly, we don't give partisan endorsements from Scott's on the Rocks Politica, but we do use our show to get people engaged as much as possible, and people that are already asking serious questions about how does my government work? How can I get more involved? What types of things should I really be focusing my attention to? Especially in these times where the forces that be, I think, sometimes are trying to get us on as unfocused as possible. And it just feels like there's a flurry of of information coming at you, most of it meaningless, we try to offer a little bit of, hey, we're not going to tell you what to do, but you might want to take a look at this, and here's why. So I really thank you, Travis, for coming on today and explaining what the campaign looks like right now. I want to point out to our listeners, this is one of the few campaigns that's ongoing that's not a specific social issue. It's procedural, and for that and that alone, it is probably, if we could really turn this around, it would have such a dramatic effect for generations to come on the way we do government. And as good as things can be relative to other states in the great Commonwealth of Massachusetts, everybody can always do better, right? And this is an example of how we must absolutely do better for ourselves.
100%, 100%. And I actually want to throw in a quick correction to what I said about the URL.
Sure.
So check out actonmass.org, specifically actonmass.org/the-campaign. So the campaign. Yeah.
Got to get that right.
Quick
And
correction.
we'll have that. We will also have that correct on the Scots on the Rocks Politica episode page. Travis Benson, ActOnMass. It has been an absolute pleasure having you here. I hope you'll come back sometime because I got a feeling this is going to be an ongoing issue for many years to come.
Yeah, this is a very modest start to a long-term fight. After this, there'll be more advocacy for changes in the State House. So we look forward to it. Thank you for having me on. It's wonderful that you're willing to, help spread the word. Thank you for that.
That's what we're about. Folks, you have been listening to a special feature of Scots on the Rocks Politica, a project of the Media Project, where we are looking to support local and regional journalism and help out all of our engaged citizens. You can find out all of our information at smgravesassociates.com/podcasts. Once again, Travis Benson, ActOnMass. I'm your host, Scott M. Graves. Thank you for listening.